A funeral home is, you assume, a small and grim little business. It is, in fact, the only retail business in America whose customer cannot cancel, cannot shop around at the moment of purchase, and arrives, on average, exactly on schedule. Every other business on earth prays for demand. This one receives it by actuarial table. The people who will use your funeral home next year are, statistically, already alive and already assigned to you by geography. The market arrives on its own. It asks only to be outlasted. Set the embarrassment down then. It is the most expensive thing you are bringing to this deal. By the end of this, you will understand the three numbers that decide whether a funeral home is a business, a job, or a slow and dignified way to lose a building. The first is the call. The second is the money people hand you for a service you will perform only 15 years from now. And the third is the one quietly dismantling the first two, one cremation at a time. Start with what you are actually buying, because a funeral home is a plant, not a store. A store sells a thing off a shelf and refills the shelf. This is a licensed building with a preparation room, a chapel, or a room pretending to be one, refrigeration, a fleet that is at minimum one hearse and usually a second car, and a licensed funeral director who is legally required for the thing to operate at all. That plant costs the same to own on a quiet Tuesday when the whole town is healthy as it does in a bad influenza February. The lights, the license, the insurance, the note on the building, the director on call at 3 in the morning, all fixed, all perfectly indifferent to whether a single family walked through the door this week. So the industry prices the business not on customers, but on the call. One death that comes to your home, start to finish, is one call. A home is bought and sold on how many services it turns over in a year, the way a hotel is bought on rooms and a garage on spaces. Everything else is downstream of that one number, and the first thing a serious buyer does is stop listening to the owner describe the neighborhood and start counting them. There is a second reason the building is expensive to own, and it is the reason a funeral home resists becoming the passive asset the buyer wants it to be. The licensed director is not a formality you can hire around cheaply. Every state requires the person arranging and directing services, and in most states, the person performing the embalming, to hold a license that takes years of schooling and a supervised apprenticeship to earn. The pool of people who hold one is aging faster than it refills, and the embalmer, specifically, is becoming scarce. So the single largest cost in the building is also the single hardest one to replace. And the owner who dreams of stepping back discovers that the very role he must hire someone into is the most expensive and least available position in the trade. You cannot automate a licensed signature. You can only pay for one. Now the part that makes each one worth having. The customer arrives in the single worst negotiating position a human being ever occupies. His mother died this morning. He has 3 days, a room full of relatives with opinions, and a culturally enforced belief that the correct amount to spend is whatever shows you loved her. He is a first-time buyer who fully intends to remain a one-time buyer. He would sooner overpay than drive across town to compare the price of a casket. The numbers follow the position. The median American funeral with a viewing and a burial runs north of $8,000, and add the vault most cemeteries demand, and you are at 10. Do it with a cremation and a service instead, and you are still near 6,300. And the casket. The casket is where the room goes quiet. A box that costs the home a fraction of what it is presented for is set, at the worst hour of a man's year, beside a nicer box, and the gap in price between the two is very often larger than the gap in cost to anyone. This pricing power is so total that the federal government felt obliged to write a rule specifically to blunt it. The funeral rule has sat on the books since the 1980s, and it is worth knowing exactly what it forces, because the shape of the protection is a photograph of the leverage. The home must hand you an itemized printed price list. It must show you a casket price list before it shows you a single coffin so the grief stays out of the arithmetic. And it may not charge you a handling fee for using a box you bought somewhere cheaper, nor require you to buy theirs to get the service. Read that backwards, and you have a confession. A government writes a rule forbidding a handling fee on outside caskets for exactly one reason: Because the handling fee on outside caskets was a reliable little machine. The regulation is the pricing power, photographed from the outside. I have watched this particular conviction arrive in my inbox more than almost any other, always in the same disbelieving tone. People assume the death business is distasteful and therefore poor. It is distasteful and quite rich, and the two facts are related. Which brings us to the second number, and the stranger one. A funeral home does not only sell funerals to the bereaved, it sells them in advance to the eventually bereaved. This is the pre-need contract, and it is the mechanic that separates this asset class from every other small business you could buy. A woman of 70 walks in perfectly healthy and arranges and pays for her own funeral today, to spare her children the decision. She hands you the money now. You will deliver the service in 12 years, or 15, or 20. Sit with the cash flow of that for a moment. You have been paid, in full, for something you will render sometime in the next 2 decades, on a date the actuarial tables estimate with unsettling confidence. In the meantime, you are holding a stranger's money. State law governs where it sits, in a trust or behind an insurance policy, and how much of it you may touch. But the structure is unmistakable. You are paid years early to warehouse the future. That is a float, in exactly the sense the insurance business runs on float, and it is the closest thing a Main Street business comes to owning a small bank whose depositors have all agreed to hold their deposits until they die. The pre-need book does something quieter and more valuable still. It pre-sells your future volume. Every signed contract is a customer committed on paper to arriving at your door and nowhere else. A home with a deep book of prepaid contracts is selling you far more than this year's funerals. It is selling you a claim on the next 20 years of the town's mortality, already booked. The money is good then, and the demand is guaranteed. You can already see the retirement forming in the buyer's mind, the tasteful sign with his name on it, the reasonable hours, the standing in the community. This is the point where the fixed costs remind everyone who is in charge. Because the overhead is fixed and the revenue arrives one funeral at a time, a home lives or dies on a single line the brochure omits, the break-even call count. Below it, the building is eating the owner. Above it, nearly every additional funeral is margin, because the hearse and the building and the director were already paid for whether that family came or not. The whole game is the distance between the funerals a home actually does and the number it must do to cover its own weight. Let me price one out so the line stops being abstract. Take an ordinary home in an ordinary mid-sized town, doing 250 calls a year, which is a healthy independent operation. The licensed staff, the director, an assistant, the part-time help who come in for services, are the largest cost and run well into 6 figures a year all in, because the license is the business and licensed people know it. The building and its upkeep, the refrigeration, the 2 vehicles with their insurance and eventual replacement, the general liability, and the 40 miscellaneous species of cost a plant accumulates. Call that another large fixed block. Somewhere in the low hundreds of funerals a year, all of it is simply covered, and not one funeral sooner. Do 300 in that same building, and the last 50 were nearly pure margin. Do 140 in that same building, and you are subsidizing a town's grief out of your retirement savings, one dignified afternoon at a time. The building is identical. The sign says the same name. The only thing that moved was a number the seller would very much prefer you take on faith. You should take it on evidence instead. The most important week you will ever spend on a funeral home is the week an accountant spends reading the actual call log, funeral by funeral, for the trailing several years, separating the business the home earns on its own from the business that walks in only because the current owner coached the Little League team for 30 years and is about to move to Arizona. Some of those funerals are leaving with him. I have read enough of these logs to tell you that the number the seller says and the number the log says are, more often than not, 2 different numbers. One more feature of the demand the brochure smooths over: deaths cluster in winter, thin out across summer, and a hard respiratory season can swing a small home's annual volume by more than the margin it was counting on. A home doing 800 a year barely feels the variance. A home doing 160 feels every quiet month personally. Scale in this business does more than lower the cost per funeral. It buys the one protection the small operator can never afford, a denominator large enough that a mild winter is a rounding error rather than a crisis. Now the third number, the one taking the first two apart. For most of the last century, the arithmetic above sat still, because the American default was a burial with a viewing and a casket and a vault, and that default carried the fat end of the price list. The default is dissolving in real time. Cremation passed half the country years ago and now runs above 60% nationally, and the industry's own trade association projects it past 80% by the middle of the 2040s. Whole regions are already there. This lands on the buyer in two separate and compounding ways, and most sellers will describe only the gentler one. The gentler one is that a cremation simply carries a smaller ticket. $6,300 against $10,000 is a real haircut on every single funeral, and it arrives whether volume holds or not. The harder one is that it quietly detaches the customer from the building altogether. A family that wants a full-service cremation with a viewing still needs your chapel and your license and your staff. But a family that wants a direct cremation, the fastest and cheapest disposition there is, needs almost none of it. They need a form, a retort, and an envelope of ashes in 10 days, and they will pay $1,500 for it, not $6,000. A whole generation of low-overhead operators has appeared to provide exactly that. Some of them entirely online, none of them heating a chapel for a viewing nobody requested. The building you are buying was sized and priced for an era that is walking out the back door. You are being asked to pay a burial era price for a cremation era stream of dollars. I will not pretend to know where the curve stops. Nobody does. But the direction is settled, and a business priced as though the direction reverses is a business priced on a hope. There is a genuine tailwind underneath all of this, and because it is the one piece of unambiguous good news in the file, the seller will lead with it. The largest generation the country ever produced is aging into the years when this business collects, and it will keep doing so for the better part of the next 2 decades. The raw number of funerals is climbing, and it climbs on a schedule as dependable as the rest of the demand. So the buyer is handed 2 curves pointing in opposite directions, volume rising because demographics, dollars per funeral falling because cremation. Whether this asset is a sound retirement or a slow disappointment comes down to which of those 2 curves wins in the specific county you are about to buy into. And the honest answer is that it depends entirely on the county, and that the seller has every incentive to show you only the curve that flatters his asking price. So tell me, before you scroll on, in the county you actually live in, which curve is winning? The graying population or the cremation? Because one of those 2 is quietly writing the future of the building on your own main street, and most people have no idea which. Now the party who has already run this entire calculation and who is very likely bidding against you. The largest death care company in North America is a publicly traded corporation that describes itself, accurately, as exactly that. It operates on the order of 1,500 funeral homes and nearly 500 cemeteries across more than 40 states and much of Canada, and it sells to the public under a single national brand of dignity and trust. You have very possibly attended a service at one of its homes and walked out certain you had been looked after by the Hendersons, a local family since before the war, because the sign out front still says exactly that. Keeping the local name on the building is not sentiment, it is the strategy. The trust is the asset, and the trust is local, so the corporation buys the trust and leaves the paint alone. This explains the price you will be asked to pay. The consolidator can pay more for a home than you can, and does so rationally. It buys the volume and the prepaid book, then runs the embalming, the accounting, the vehicle fleet, the merchandise purchasing, and the back office across hundreds of locations at a cost per funeral, more cheaply than any single building can reach. It is the same shape anyone who watched the mobile home park video will recognize on site. There, the resident could not afford to move the home off the pad. Here, the customer cannot afford to shop at the moment he buys, and the operator who can process that captive demand at the lowest cost wins the auction for the building. The captive customer and the low-cost processor are made for each other. You are, unfortunately, neither. The pre-need float has a shadow. And it is worth naming, because it is the specific way this asset class goes catastrophically wrong. You are holding money today for a service you owe in 15 years. That gap is a temptation with a very long fuse. The largest cautionary tale in the modern industry is a Missouri company that sold prepaid funeral contracts across many states and took in an enormous sum of families' money that was supposed to be sitting in trust, waiting quietly for each funeral to come due. When the arrangements began coming due, a great deal of it was simply gone, spent long before the first of those funerals was owed. And the men who ran it went to federal prison. Every tightening of prepaid funeral trust law in the years since is a scar from that wound. For a buyer, the lesson is unglamorous and absolute. When you acquire a home with a book of prepaid contracts, you are not only buying its future funerals, you are inheriting its future obligations, and the only thing standing between you and a line of families holding paid-in-full contracts is whether the trust behind those contracts is verifiably funded. That is a question for the trust, asked in writing, with a lawyer, before you sign a single page. 3 ways this plays out then, depending on the number you land on. The rural single home doing well under 200 funerals in a shrinking county is, on honest inspection, a job rather than an investment. The owner is the director, works most weekends and most nights, and has, in plain terms, bought himself a demanding position with unsociable hours and a building attached. It can be a fine life. It is rarely a retirement because retiring means hiring a licensed director to replace the one function the license insists only a licensed person may perform. The mid-size home that clears its break-even with real margin, carries a properly funded book, and sits in a county whose population is at least holding, is the version that actually works. It throws off cash, it can be staffed to run without the owner physically present, and its book of contracts is a coupon on a decade of demand that will arrive whether or not anyone markets to it. This is the home worth buying, which is exactly why the consolidator wants it too, and exactly why it rarely trades cheap. And the combined home and cemetery, the version that owns the ground as well as the service, is a larger and stranger animal because a cemetery sells the same acre of earth many times over and books the maintenance of it as an obligation that runs forever. That one is less a retirement than a small institution, priced accordingly, and generally beyond the buyer this channel is built for. Set the embarrassment down for good then, and pick up the arithmetic in its place. The demand is real and it is guaranteed in the coldest and most literal sense any business has ever been able to claim. The customers are, as promised, already alive and already assigned to you, and they will arrive on schedule because the schedule is written into the one appointment none of them will miss. That much the brochure has right, even where it phrases it more gently. What the brochure leaves out is that the number of arrivals is drifting one way, while the dollars per arrival drift the other, that the money you were paid in advance is a blessing precisely as long as it is still there at all, and that the corporation quietly outbidding you has run every one of these numbers already, and simply left the local family's name on the door. The customers will come. They always come. Exactly on schedule. Whether the margin comes with them is the only open question worth asking, and it is the expensive part of an otherwise perfectly reasonable retirement.